Right. Good to see everybody tonight. Tonight is our last night before we begin our summer series next week. So beginning next week, we'll have different ones bringing these character studies from the Bible, and we'll hopefully pick up our study of the life of Christ again later in the year after the summer series. Now, tonight we've been through the Roman trial, and now we're going to see as the end of that has come and Jesus is led away to the cross. And then when we have the opportunity to study again, we'll be looking at the crucifixion. Now, our text tonight, all four of the gospel writers record this event. Matthew in chapter 27, verses 31 through 34. Mark records it in chapter 15, verses 20 through 22. Luke in chapter 23, verses 26 to 31. And John in chapter 19, verses 19 through 22. Now, right now we're going to primarily focus in on Mark's account again, as we have most of these weeks, but I want us to read Matthew's first. Matthew and Mark both give us a little bit of information the other does not. So Matthew 27, verses 31 to 34. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. Now as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of a skull, they gave him sour wine mingled with gall to drink. But when he had tasted it, he would not drink it. And then let's go to Mark chapter 15. Verses 20 to 23. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by, to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of a skull. There they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it. So let's stop just a second now and let's think back upon the events that have taken us to this point. Mark has revealed to us, think back to that agonizing night for Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he prepared himself for the trials that lay ahead of him. In chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. And as we continued in that chapter, we found one of the 12, one of his beloved 12, Judas, would betray him into the hands of men. And the mob that would come and they would arrest Jesus in the garden. And as we continued on in chapter 14, we find the beating and the mocking of Jesus at the scam of a trial held by Caiaphas. We would find his beloved Peter, one of his closest friends of all, would deny him in the hour of trial. Jesus, in chapter 15, has been scourged. He has been beaten. He has been mocked. And he has been humiliated by the Roman soldiers. And so as we get to our text today, as Jesus is led away think about what he's been through and where Jesus would be at this time, because he would have to be completely exhausted physically. Virtually every ounce of strength would be gone out of him by this point. He would not have slept since before the Garden of Gethsemane, even before the supper, before that. He had been beaten without mercy. He had been beaten in a scourging worse than any other man had ever endured. And so as they lead him out to Calvary now, his skin is ripped to shreds. Think of the amount of blood that he has lost. Think of the fact that he would still be bleeding without doubt. And so, in all of that, he's completely unrecognizable, the writers have told us, from the beating. I mean, imagine his face from the crown of thorns, covered in blood, his eyes probably swollen shut. What an awful sight it would have been. And as bad as it was, the worst is still to come. It's only going to be worse. He is now condemned to die by crucifixion. And so the Roman soldiers would lead him to the hill called Calvary. You know, I think of all of the songs that we sing about these events. And so the road to the cross begins in verse 20. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So they're leading him out up to this hill of Calvary. Now, notice it says they led him. Now, it could be, he may not have been able to see. It is I can't say definitively, but it is very possible Jesus could not even see. His eyes possibly swollen shut. Think about that in that state, having to be led. But Jesus would start the route now, bearing the cross upon his shoulders. I don't know what it weighed, but it had to be heavy. Especially heavy if you were in the condition that Jesus was. In John's account in chapter 19 in verse 17, it says, "And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull," which is in Hebrew, Golgotha. Now, it may be, again, I can't say for sure, but it may be that as he's going along, he starts out carrying it, and it could be that he reached a point, I'm going to guess it was probably, because it says it was close to the city, so maybe a mile or so, maybe 2 miles. He may have reached a point that he just physically could no longer do it without collapsing. But it might even be that maybe Jesus was still carrying it, but maybe he just couldn't carry it fast enough to suit those who were ready to excitedly get to the festivities to watch this. Whatever the reason be, it was horrible. Luke, adding to the humiliation is going to be the crowd. This wasn't just Jesus and some soldiers going out to his death. Luke tells us of the crowd. Go to Luke 23, and let's pick up in verse 27. In this condition, and now look at this, and a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? Look at the compassion of Jesus even in this time. He's worried about them. What he's talking about, which is still 25 to 30 years later, when Jerusalem would fall and it would be destroyed, and how hard it would be for those who would choose to follow Jesus, how tough life was going to be. Followed then by those days of persecutions. Now Luke here, he referred to the destination they were headed to as Calvary. There in verse 33, when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Now, what I've read, Calvary means the place of a skull, and Calvary is, they said, I read a Latin word for skull. And Golgotha is a transliteration of the Aramaic word for skull. So, talking about the same place. Verse 21 tells us that Simon, back in our text now, Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. Matthew didn't give us this information. Now, I don't know, but it's possible that this Rufus is the same one that Paul would mention in Romans 16 among some of the brethren there in Rome some years later. But whether it is or not, Calvary was outside of the city. And this is told to us, but even though it's outside of the city, it's not far out. But Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 12 says, Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Jesus' blood was shed, that flowed both ways at Calvary. He was outside the city. Now, back in John 19 and verse 20, then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. So it's close by, maybe a mile, maybe two. And so Jesus, at some point now, he's assisted by Simon, and they come to the hill of Golgotha. It reminds me of a song I've heard. Some of you are probably familiar with it, but there's a song called If That Isn't Love. And, as you think about him in that march to Calvary's hill, he left the splendor of heaven, knowing his destiny was the lonely hill of Golgotha, there to lay down his life for me. And if that isn't love, then the ocean is dry. There's no stars in the sky, and the little sparrows can't fly. Yes, if that isn't love, then heaven's a myth. There's no feeling like this. if that isn't love. How, again, as I've said the last several weeks, how can you consider these things and it not bring a tear to your eye, a lump to your throat? And so Jesus arrives at the cross. He would be nailed to the cross. In verse 23 it says, "And they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it." So as soon as they got there, they crucify him upon arrival. Now, this wine and myrrh would have been something of a sympathetic gesture. It would help to deaden his pain if he wanted it. But note that Jesus would fully endure it all. He would not take it. He refused it. And so, in the few minutes we have the rest of this evening, and again we will consider the crucifixion when we resume this study, but let's look at some things about exactly what a crucifixion is. Now Luke, as we mentioned, said Calvary was the place of a skull, and they're outside the city, as we noted in Hebrews 13:12 and John 19:20. And they crucified him as soon as they got there, and he would bear it all. But let's consider a crucifixion. A crucifixion usually began with a scourging, a terrible ordeal of itself. Jesus, as we know, had already underwent this dreaded punishment from John 19. Isaiah had prophesied it in chapter 52. Now remember, Pilate had ordered the scourging, and Pilate, his intent in the scourging was to perhaps evoke some sympathy from the Jews. He thought maybe when they saw, if he made it extra hard, when the Jews saw the beating that Jesus had taken, they might have sympathy for him and decide that they want him released instead of Barabbas. But in this scourging, instead, Pilate had miscalculated, and it only served to make Jesus' accusers all the more angry, all the more intent for the Lord to die. Now, at a cross, or at a crucifixion, they were always outside the city there, and the victim was usually forced to carry his cross. Sometimes he would even be goaded and beaten along the way. The execution site would always be in a public place. It would usually be along a prominent road or on a hill where the victim could easily be seen. The victim would be stripped naked, all of their dignity removed. If they were lucky, they might be allowed a loincloth. The cross itself. The cross itself would be formed as a T or an X. The victim would be laid upon the cross, and nails were driven through his hands and feet. Sometimes thongs were also used to prevent the body from slipping off the cross if the body gave way, through the nails, if it ripped completely through the skin. And the cross, for many years I had a mental picture of him being way up on a cross, but that wasn't accurate. The cross would usually be, the feet would be no more than a foot or two off the ground. You see, so close to relief, but they couldn't get to it. So far away. A large nail would be driven through each hand and another through each foot, or one nail through both foot, whichever the case would be. Psalm 22 speaks of this. Luke 24:39, John 20 verses 24 to 28. Sometimes a wooden rod was inserted between the legs as support for the sagging body to prevent the nails from tearing all the way from the hands and feet. And during the crucifixion, one of the few acts of mercy to a crucifixion was the practice of giving the subject a drink of medication, wine, sour wine mingled with gall, or basically vinegar. It would induce grogginess. It would help to deaden the pain. But Jesus would not take that offer. For you and I, he was going to fully taste death. Later on in the crucifixion, he would be offered a drink of vinegar and a sponge. This was a mixture of wine and water, which was used by the soldiers. The hyssop stalk or reed on which it was raised up to the Lord to reach. And now, as we think more of the cruelty, this is how death would come to the victim. You see, the wounds of the crucifixion did not result in the loss of a great amount of blood. The wounds itself, into his hands and feet, were not directly fatal. Instead, historians tell us the cause of death would be more like this. The unnatural position and the violent tension of the body caused great pain from even the smallest of movements. The great agonies experienced would contribute to the death. The nails that were driven through the hands and feet. Think about the hand and the foot. Great center of what in your body? Nerves. Those nerve centers in your body. Look at the agony that would cause. Many of you have dealt with nerve pain at times and know how bad that is. It would cause great agony. But while you're up there, there's also the exposure of all of the wounds and the lacerations, including those from the scourging. Inflammation would be increasing by the hour, and of course all of that exposed skin, if you linger very long, it's going to witness the onset of gangrene. The pain, in essence, is increasing by the minute as one stays up there. In the distended parts of the body, more blood flows through the arteries than can be carried back into the veins. So too much blood finds its way from the aorta into the head and the stomach. And the blood vessels of the head become pressed and swollen. The general obstruction of circulation worsens by the minute. And of course that brings on an exertion to fight it. It brings on anxiety in the mind, which might be even more intolerable than death itself. But this gradually increasing and lingering agony, the unbearable thirst, the increasing difficulty in breathing, having to lift up to be able to get a breath, but searing pain every time you lift up. It would eventually bring about death. Now, depending on the physical health and well-being of the individual, the victim's death would range from hours to several days. Strong's speaks of one that this was a young man, a Turkish slave, who was crucified on Friday and did not die till Sunday. Think about that, in that pain. It was noted that he was an exceptionally rugged individual. And so, as unspeakably inhumane as this mode of execution was, it stopped. Think about, we have executions in this country. There are a number of them every year. But in all the executions in the United States, whether it be a lethal injection, whether it be a firing squad, whether it be a gas chamber, what are they all designed to do besides kill you? Quickly. It's designed to kill quickly and with little pain. These lethal injections, they're dead in 45 seconds to a minute usually. They take a few deep breaths and sighs, and they're gone. A firing squad, when you're hit in the heart with about half a dozen bullets, you're dead before your body even reacts to the pain. They're gone. But you see, a crucifixion, it stops just short of producing a merciful death. It stops from delivering you from the agony. And those who are executed often lingered for several days at times. They were unable to live and unable to die. The awful position of the body made every movement one of agony. The pierced hands and feet, inflamed and infected, the arteries distended and blocked, fever going through the roof, intolerable headache. Many went into insanity before they would die. And it was this death that our Lord Jesus was condemned to. And this was done by men who were supposed to be the guardians of the truth and the favor of Jehovah God. The very people that Jesus was dying for were the ones who were killing him. How can we walk out of here and allow a sacrifice of that nature to be in vain in our case? We can't do that. A God who would give that for us, we owe him everything. We owe him every ounce of our energy till we take our last breath. And even then, we've not even begun to repay what he did, because there's no amount of work that any of us can do to earn it ourselves. Instead, each one of us earned death through the wages of sin. But that blood he shed will wash it clean. And living faithfully, his blood can continue to cleanse us for the rest of our lives. Because you're going to stumble. You're going to have those moments where you fall short in sin. But that blood will keep cleansing as long as you will repent of those sins and get back up and follow him. Tonight, where are you standing? Where is the cross for you? What are you going to do about Jesus? We can help you in any way this evening. Let it be known as we stand together and sing.